Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
From time to time, I do videos about cops who get in trouble, and sometimes they get fired or they quit. And people will often comment and say, Steve, you understand that when the person quits or gets fired from one force, they just show up in another force 2 counties over. And, that's probably true, but how true is it? And it turns out that they've now studied this, and they discovered it can be a problem. So from the Badger Project, Peter Cameron writes for MSN, and Jerry sent me the article. At least 12 current officers in western Wisconsin were fired or forced out from previous jobs in law enforcement. At least 12, currently working in La Crosse County and the surrounding areas, have been fired or forced out from previous jobs in law enforcement, according to an investigation by the Badger Project. One major study found that these wandering officers who were fired or forced out from one law enforcement agency and hired at another were more likely to commit violations and be fired again. So it's not a learning experience for them. They get, fired or forced out over here. They go over here and they get fired or forced out again. So most of these officers in western Wisconsin were young and failed to pass their new hire probation, a period that can last up to 24 months when the bar to fire an officer can be very low. But if they fail to qualify here and they wind up over here, what happened between the two places that suddenly made them a good police officer? Some, however, were forced out for more serious conduct. One that they cite here, currently employed by the Norwalk Police Department in Monroe County and by the Army as a police officer at Fort McCoy, resigned prior to completion of an internal investigation from the Monroe County Sheriff's Office in 2019, according to the Wisconsin Department of Justice. He was accused of repeatedly taking the long way to arrive at 911 calls so he wouldn't have to be the lead officer, according to an internal investigation obtained in a records request. Norwalk police did not respond to messages seeking comment, but that does seem like a serious problem. Someone calls 911, and this guy is dispatched, and he purposely goes slower, taking the long way, to make sure that someone else gets there first and gets to be the one who does the paperwork. Meanwhile, another currently employed at the Black River Falls Police Department failed to complete more than 300 police reports while he was an officer on probation with the Janesville Police Department. As according to an internal investigation obtained in a records request, his superiors accused him of being disingenuous when the officer said he was following his training, noting in the investigation evidence contradictory to his claim. He resigned in lieu of termination in 2018. And they had a whole list of officers here that had been involved or caught up in this. And many of them said resigned in lieu of investigation. So in other words, they were told, we're about to start investigating you, and they quit. And by quitting, they ended the investigation. Neither that man nor his current chief responded to messages seeking comment. Law enforcement agencies in Wisconsin must report officers who were fired or resigned while under investigation or in lieu of termination to the State Department of Justice, which tracks the data. Law enforcement agencies can also consult the database before making hires and will be notified if a new hire has previously been flagged in the system, according to the director of the state's Training and Standards Bureau. So the departments they go to should know where they came from. But the question is, do they follow up? And if they do they care? As long as officers keep up to date with their recertification training, only severe misconduct, such as criminal activity, actually results in decertification, according to Wisconsin law. Now, about 13,500 law enforcement officers are currently employed around the state, and about 200 of those have been fired or forced out from previous jobs in the field. That's a rate of about 1.5%. So when you look at the whole population of law enforcement in the state of Wisconsin, 98.5% of them don't pop up on this list. 1.5% do. And out of a population of 13,500, that's a good number. So in total, more than 1,200 Wisconsin officers have been fired or forced out since 2017. And that's when the State Department of Justice started tracking these numbers. Now, Yale Law Journal, the Yale Law Journal, did a huge study called The Wandering Officer. And they found that in Florida, for example, cops who'd been fired from a previous law enforcement job were more likely to be fired from their next job or to receive a complaint for moral character violation compared to rookies or officers who've never been fired. So it appears that the repeat offenders do exist, and that's what you're worried about. A study analyzed nearly 100,000 full-time law enforcement officers from nearly 500 agencies over 30 years in Florida. Although we cannot determine the precise reasons for the firings, these results suggest that wandering officers may pose serious risks, particularly given how difficult it is to fire a police officer. So, officers in Wisconsin who've been fired or forced out may find an easier entry back into the law enforcement workforce thanks to the current hiring situation. The total number of both officers and law enforcement academy graduates in the state fell to its lowest level in more than a decade last year, according to data from the state DOJ, further worsening a long-term trend experts call the cop crunch. So they are having a hard time finding officers or people who want to become officers. So there's a shortage of them, and that does play into this. Some law enforcement agencies in western Wisconsin appear more willing to hire these wandering officers than others. The Arcadia Police Department has 3 such officers on staff at the moment, according to state DOJ records. The police department in Osseo and Black Rivers Fall employ 2 each. The police chief at Osseo declined to respond in an email. He said, after consideration, I'm declining to make a comment at this time. And yet, he just made a comment. So, Patrick Solar, an associate professor of criminal justice at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville, and a former police chief, takes a hardline stance on the idea of hiring an officer who had been fired for cause. I do not feel an officer who has violated their oath should get a second chance, he wrote. I don't care how short-handed they are. Law enforcement is not a job that just anyone can do. But he is softer on the idea of hiring officers who do not pass probation at a previous law enforcement agency. That's different. Some agencies do not do a good job of training potentially good officers, so yes, they should get another shot, depending, of course, on the severity of the mistakes involved. And I guess it's kind of like when you have to take a test to join a profession, and if you fail the test, they let you retake it. So if you fail the probationary period in one place, if you can pass it someplace else, I agree with that makes sense. But I do also see the very serious issue here, and that is that officers who get fired for cause or who are about to get fired for cause and then quit to prevent that from happening can just go county over and work someplace else. And so, as they note, the officers who do that are more likely to reoffend than a typical officer, which suggests that they don't learn their lesson or that they've got some other problem that they can't necessarily control. And so, we joke about this, but keep in mind the numbers we're talking about here. Okay, so there's 13,500 police officers in Wisconsin, and about 200 of them had been fired or forced out from their previous jobs. So 200. So that's a fairly small number, and as noted, it's 1.5%, right? But we also know that there are people who are drawn to professions for the right reason and people who are drawn for the wrong reason. So I can tell you that I know attorneys who became attorneys because they like to argue. I actually know someone who said, I like to argue, so I became an attorney. Okay? It's not the skill you need to become an attorney, but if that makes something you enjoy here, part of your job, I guess. But and so people get drawn to a field for whatever reason. And so you'd hope that a police officer would be drawn to that job because he wants to help his community and he sees that he can do some good and it's something he's passionate about, or she, right? But we've also heard of the police officers who became police officers because they like being bullies. So if you grow up as a bully, what job do you get where you can push people around? Well, you become a bouncer at a bar, or you can become a cop. And I'm not saying all cops are bullies. I'm not saying that. But I suspect that a police officer, if asked and was honest about the answer, would say, yes, I have met someone who became a police officer primarily because they were a bully. I guarantee you that if you spoke to somebody who knew a lot of police officers, they'd tell you that. And so those are the people that should be weeded out. And they need to come up with a better way. I mean, at least Wisconsin's tracking them, right? We're tracking them. We're not doing anything about it, but we're tracking them. Okay, that's step one. But you've got to look at it and go, okay, I understand that you're short on police officers, but do you really want to fill the hole in your force with the guy who takes the long way to an emergency so he can avoid the paperwork? Is that what you want? Really? Because that seems like that's not the kind of person you want to hire. But we'll see. So they've done the math on this, and it's 1.5% are wandering police officers. And I suspect those are very similar to the numbers in other states. I don't know if it might be better or worse in other states. I've not heard of any states that are actually cracking down on this, but it's usually stories like this that shine a light on something where people start thinking about it. And I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere down the line, somebody says, you know something, maybe we should have some legislation on this. Maybe we should. Maybe we should say that if you are fired or forced out of a previous job, you've got to do something to recertify to become a cop somewhere else to make sure that they're not hiring someone's going to come in and do the exact same thing again. The old fool me once thing. So that's the article, and it's quite lengthy. I only read part of it there. But Jerry sent it, thanks a lot, by Peter Cameron and the Badger Project. At least 12 current officers in western Wisconsin were fired or forced out from previous jobs in law enforcement. Statewide, the number's closer to 200. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. If you want to make a dangerous man your friend, let him do you a favor.